Welcome back. So, of course, the world's still reacting to the big story coming out of the United States. In the latest, Vice President Kamala Harris officially conceding to Donald Trump following his sweeping victory in the presidential election there. Making that speech at Howard University in Washington, Harris said the Biden administration would engage in a peaceful transfer of power.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright. As long as we never give up and as long as we keep fighting.
All right, let's make sense of that development. Bring in Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Associate with the Institute for Global Dialogue, and joins us now via our video link. Sanusha, welcome to the SABC News Channel. Great to talk to you again. I'm tempted to start by asking you about the latest here at home before we reflect on the situation in the US. I'm sure you've seen the news around Dali Mpofu crossing floors from the EFF to the MK party. He reckons this is because the MK party is the only vehicle, he says, that will really drive through unity. And I wonder, I'll ask you the same question I did to our previous guest, whether you buy that reasoning.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers. I think this last 24-36 hours tells us how uncanny politics is. It's never a dull moment, but it's always very, very driven by a lot of activity, and it feels like you're living in a world of steroids. But I don't know. These things are so fluid right at the moment. The shift from the EFF to the MK by previous EFF members doesn't necessarily say that you're going to drive unity. I think the challenge right now, and I think this is a global issue for all political parties, and what is happening if we take our cue from what has been defined in the US in the last 24 to 36 hours. Is that you are having an incredible kind of ringside view of what is democracy. This is really the big question. Is that does democracy in the way that it has been implemented, in the way that it actually is characterized, does it really represent the kind of unity that we're talking about? It does actually talk about issues in terms of the nature of democracy. And it's this kind of moving of musical chairs from one party to another, and then kind of giving this impression that if I move to another party, I can actually see the political unity. I'm not sure. I think the lesson to learn from what has happened in the US is that there are key issues, and I think those that move from one party to another must be very careful in realizing that at the end of the day, if you don't actually talk to what the electorate wants, they can actually come back and hurt you in a very, very real way.
What a beautiful way to tie what's taking place here at home and in the US. And there's been, a lot of reflection, I suppose, around how even the US got there. On the one hand, at least from the commentary I've seen, there are people who are really laying the blame squarely at the feet of the Democratic Party, not having a plan. They should have pulled Joe Biden back earlier than they did. Kamala Harris wasn't really propped up to be presidential. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are individuals who are saying that this election outcome in the US is a clear reflection that the country was never ready for a black female president anyway. I wonder where you stand on that spectrum.
Well, I think it's a little bit more than that. Obviously the challenge right now is to unpack and disaggregate what has happened in the context of the election results, where for many people, I think the whole kind of personality and specter of Donald Trump was almost an aversion to some, that, the kind of politics, the kind of campaigning, the kind of character that he had was kind of very difficult to align with or to connect with. And yet he won this election, not just won this election, he flipped the 2020 election on its head in terms of where he was. And if you look at what's going on in the US right now, the Senate most likely will become Republican. And of course, we're still waiting to hear what the House of Representatives would look like in composition.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I think what is important for us to bear in mind here is that, the Biden administration came in at a time when the first term of Donald Trump was actually coming at that point where the COVID was really a big issue in the U.S. Questions around the vaccine. There was this notion of denialism, and of course the impact that this had on the economy. And so Biden comes in and he tries to take on that. And of course, there was a need for the kind of real change that you wanted. People in the US were really suffering as a result of the impact of the COVID pandemic. And of course, there was also the question of how this impacted on people's lives and livelihoods. And so they were able to build on that. And I think 4 years later, what you have is people wondering to what extent has those issues, particularly around their lives, their livelihoods, the economy was the major issue in this election. If you look at the polls, it was the economy, it was the question of people were not able to afford their mortgages, it was inflation. I mean, I've been hearing in the last 24 hours with various interactions that it was about people not being able to buy basic food stuff. It was so costly. And these were the things that Donald Trump hit home on. But also he went back and he used the narrative in a way to try and push out what he would do, the promises he made. And if you listen to his victory speech on Tuesday evening at the convention center in Florida, he said, I made promises and now I'm going to act on these promises. And so people are looking for that kind of issue. But the other thing that's coming out very clearly is that there was a trust deficit in this democracy in the US. And it was a trust deficit as well in terms of whether the Democrats were talking the language, were able to deliver. And I think the other issue is I don't really want to take into account this issue that the U.S. is not ready for a female black president. I think this is just a bit of a reasoning that's much more superficial. But I think it's also the question of, did Kamala Harris be able to find her own ownership of her campaign? Remember, she comes in late. She's the candidate that takes over from Biden. And more importantly, there's this challenge around, she didn't want to see her campaign being a kind of discontinuity from the Biden campaign. And more importantly, there's a loyalty there. And I think these are dynamics as well. So I think for the Democratic Party, the question is, how do they go back to regrouping? What is going to be their strategy? How are they going to move forward in terms of leadership? And are they able to push again in terms of midterms that come up in the next 4 years, and of course the next election in 2028?
Yeah, in fact, Kamala Harris was perhaps infamously asked what she would do differently to Joe Biden, and she answers by saying something along the lines of she wouldn't really change much. And perhaps that actually worked against her, ironically, given, just the state in which people found themselves, economically speaking, the cost of living crisis in places like the United States. But, Sanusha, I wonder to what extent what actually happened in the US is different to what we've seen take place everywhere else around the world. What do I mean by that? This idea that people are pushing back against the incumbents, the status quo as it existed, people are saying at these ballot boxes, should change.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ayanda, that's a very important question, because you're seeing it not just in, as you saw now in the latest presidential election in the US, but you're also seeing it in Europe, this pushback. And I think it's also the question of, the economy tied to democracy. It's about democracy. Is this fashioning of democracy really meeting the kind of needs of people, the transformation issues? And what's happening as well is that, coupled into that or interspersed into that is the whole issue around the populism. So you've got somebody who is able to speak the speak of ordinary people. It's not fancy. Is it anti-establishment that you're seeing this pushback? And I think invariably what we're going to start seeing across the globe is how people are viewing democracy. And there's a younger generation coming in who actually have no loyalty to anybody. They're looking at their own livelihoods. They're looking at their own future. And I think one of the big key policy questions for us going forward is, what does this mean for the kind of intrinsic dynamics of democracy going forward? What is happening? Are political parties really representing the interests of people? And so I think what you're seeing in the US is what's going to become, I think, par for the course going forward with regard to the fact that it's never going to be the same. I think all political parties, whether you are in the US, whether you are in South Africa, cannot continue to just assume that if they spew out rhetoric, they will get the votes. And I think what we saw in the last couple of hours in South Africa, what we're seeing in South Africa with the MK party is be careful, I would say, is don't assume that if you keep using the narrative of economic transformation and the lack of that, you're going to keep having people voting for you. You've got to now stand up and be quite alert to what's happening. So there's also that dynamic around how are people looking at democracy and the trust issue within it.
Sure. Fascinating as always. Sanusha Naidu, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us as we make sense of what on earth is happening around the world. Sanusha is a senior research associate for the Institute for Global Dialogue. Once again, Sanusha, thanks very much indeed.